Anyway? What do you mean, anyway? I was almost killed back there.
So, we have a musical moment coming up that it occurs in the original game, and it occurs now in the remake in a slightly different way, but it occurs at the same time that it did in the original. We are getting the Magdalene theme again. And in the original, this was the only time you heard it. But now, we've got it with the context of all this other stuff. And I'll talk more about that once we hit that moment. That door creak sounded like a friggin' like stab of the orchestra or something, or horns. And here we autosave, but I just saved. Go.
Run!
I also agree, they could have choreographed this scene a little bit better. Having Maria so far ahead of you at this point feels very disingenuous. Here we got a Kool-Aid Man moment. Oh yeah! I shouldn't be disrupting the tension at this moment.
There! An elevator! Come on, hurry!
Her performance right here. So the version of Magdalene that we're hearing right now, as far as I can tell, does not appear anywhere on the official soundtrack. Because we get the Anam Cara version, which we heard in the jukebox, and then there's Magdalene's Tearful Lament, which is closer to the version of Magdalene from the original game. But right now, all we're hearing is that melody and this synth supporting it in the background. We never get to the chords that you hear in Magdalene or in Magdalene's Tearful Lament. We're just getting this repetition of the melody. And then that final note there at the end. Which is so very interesting to me, because I had all this stuff I was going to talk about with the chords that you hear in the regular version of Magdalene and Magdalene's Tearful Lament, where in the original, like, I also think it's in a different key, because I think up until now it's been in F minor, and now it's in G minor. But in the original, in the full version of this piece, after it does that melody a few times, you get this. I figured it out in F minor, so I'm just going to play in F minor so I don't waste a bunch of time here. In the original, you get this chord that's like. And it's like. In Magdalene's Tearful Lament, which is the version on the new soundtrack, it goes... And then the chords are, I think, like a... And both have different qualities that are interesting. And what I was going to say about those is how those chords to me always evoke this feeling of like, okay, we're hearing this simple plaintive melody, but those chords start to incorporate non-diatonic notes. I've been like, this is the whole reason I've been talking about non-diatonic stuff up until this point, is to talk about how like, oh, here we have these tonal clusters that introduce non-diatonic notes to suggest almost like, oh, we're getting the Mary theme, but there's something wrong with it here. And then when I was watching Hollow's playthrough of this, it hits this moment and I'm like, they never play the chords. They just have the melody, the main melody play over and over again, and then it ends on this... And it just hits that root note twice at the end. And you get this swell of the synth behind it. But it changes the moment for me. And it's not in a bad way necessarily. It's just different in a really interesting way. And it makes me wonder why they made that choice. Why not include those chords there? Perhaps it was because they didn't want it disrupting the stuff you get to after this moment. Or perhaps they thought it felt more emotionally affecting for it to just be that melody on its own. But I think I need to take some more time to think about what that might mean. All of that said, it still serves the same purpose in a storytelling sense of we are getting this melody, and even in the original game when it wasn't like this, we didn't have that earlier version, the Anam Cara version on the jukebox. I always took this moment as Maria just died, and James is remembering Mary's death. That is what this moment is supposed to do. And that is intensified by the way that they've reincorporated this theme into earlier parts of the soundtrack and introduced it actually in the jukebox scene as a theme for Mary, where we have the... And then, yeah, we get this moment, like Cleo's saying, it's almost like in his shock, the grief that's triggered, he doesn't get the not Mary feeling without those chords. He's not distinguishing the two. That is an interesting interpretation of it. The moments overlap, the women overlap in such a way where it's like they're almost one and the same at this point. But yeah, like the first, when I played the original and I hit this moment, it was such a, again, emotionally affecting moment where I was going to bring it up, but I remember like just scratching the name Maria with like an exclamation point into a sketchbook I had at the time, because it was like, holy shit, I was not expecting that. I think that's the same case for most people who play this game. It's like, oh, Maria, she seems like she's going to be like a main character. She's got all these connections to Mary. Clearly she's going to be around. And she just died. And Amat's also saying, Cleo, I agree, but I also wonder if on some level it reflects a less complicated grief. Like James tried to save Maria here. There's less reason for guilt. That's an interesting way to think about it. Cleo says, I do kind of wonder if he does feel guilty for not being strong enough to hold the doors open. But that's a lack, not a malicious action. And Amat says, agreed on all counts for sure. Yeah, it is such an interesting moment. And it made all the more interesting because of that slight change. Having it have this, and the synth that swells in the background, it almost to me gives it this dreamlike feeling of like, almost like disbelief. Like, wait, did that just happen? Did that actually just happen? It did, but no, it could. How did that just happen? There's something about the music that almost, I think that little synth patch that fades in and out feels more emotionally connected to like what the player is experiencing and what James is experiencing too, but it's like bridging an emotional gap there that may have been there before. Yeah, and like Cleo's saying, we come up with like 5 different interpretations of everything and just decide they're all probably right, because that's the way this game was kind of designed. Like, people on the Reddit will get mad at people for trying to find meaning in everything, or like, oh well, like what does it matter? Like just, or like this thing only means one thing. It's like, I feel like I'm pretty sure the developers are on record as saying like, hey, things are left up to interpretation for a reason. And just on an artistic level, this is the sort of story where it's like you bring your own baggage to it, and that is part of the experience. You don't necessarily want to like get down on others for thinking something different, or be like, oh well, this is what I felt about it, so that's what it means exactly. But I think if you hit a moment like this and you feel something in particular that is different from what other people, like it's a valid interpretation. There are certain things that perhaps go outside the bounds of valid interpretations. Like if you're looking at this and like, oh, I thought this moment was all about Angela. Like if you can make that work, go for it. But that is not necessarily the direction I would go with it. We're already way past time. Thank you guys for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed this. This really like fascinating discussion about a piece that it's so interesting that they like have done so many different things with it in this game, and in this one moment they did something that I was not expecting them to do. And again, I'm pretty like, we have Magdalene's Tearful Lament and Anam Cara on the soundtrack, and there are other tracks that like bring the theme back in certain ways, but that particular track that we just heard, I don't think is on the soundtrack anywhere, which is really interesting. I almost wonder if it's a sort of thing where they didn't want to spoil people, or they wanted it to be a thing that like, if somehow you came across the soundtrack before playing the game, they didn't want you to be primed for that moment. Anyway.